Just one line tonight.
You can't keep leaving these, Raf. It's not...
It's payment. Till I find the one I lost.
What are you carrying, Raf?
Thursday mornings belonged to the people who'd been awake while everyone else slept. By the time London decided it was morning, by the time cafes switched on their espresso machines and commuters began their practiced impatience, Raf had already seen a week's worth of private catastrophes. He stepped out of the ambulance bay into a sky that couldn't commit to color. The air smelled of damp concrete and the leftover tang of disinfectant that lived in his hair no matter how often he washed it. His uniform shirt was creased at the elbows and his boots held a film of street grit that never quite came off. The radio had finally gone quiet, but his mind still replayed its tones, clipped addresses, coded urgency, voices in the wrong key because the body inside them was managing fear. He walked without haste. There was no rush now. That was the problem. Without the next call, his thoughts had room. Raf's route took him through streets that tourists photographed later in the day, once the city had put on a cleaner face. Now the pavements were mostly empty, slick with the residue of last night's drizzle. Delivery vans coughed at the curb. A fox, real, not emblematic, skirted a bin and vanished into a gap between railings as if London itself had opened a seam to accommodate it. Raf's hands ached in the particular way they did after compressions. His wrists carried the memory of stubborn ribs. He flexed his fingers, then tucked them into his coat pockets and kept walking. He could have gone home. He rarely did, not straight away. Home meant a silent flat, a kettle, a sofa that held his shape like a confession, and the moment when he'd have to decide whether to sleep or lie there with his eyes shut and watch the night's work replay itself behind his eyelids. Instead, he went to the bookshop. Not because he was a reader, he wasn't. Not in the way people meant it, the way they said I'm a reader like it was a citizenship. Raf had read what he needed for exams, read patient leaflets, read the grim little stickers on drug boxes that said do not crush, read the occasional novel on holiday, and admired how other people could live in a story for hours without needing to check for a pulse. He went to the bookshop because it was warm and because nobody there asked him to perform an opinion. The bookshop didn't care what he knew. It cared that he handled things gently. And lately because the bookshop felt like the only place where the sentence might come back. Bramble and Company sat just off Charing Cross Road, tucked into a side street that looked like it had been built to hide something. The sign above the door was faded green, as if it had once been proud and then decided pride was bad for business. A brass bell hung inside and made a small, clean sound when you entered. Raf pushed open the door and stepped into paper warmth. The smell hit him first. Old dust, glue, coffee, a faint citrus note from the cat's shampoo or someone's hand cream. The shop was narrow, tall, and crowded in a way that felt deliberate. Books stacked in towers made their own geography. A ladder leaned against a shelf and looked judgmental. Behind the counter stood Ivy Calder, hair pinned back, cardigan sleeves pushed to her forearms as if she'd already decided the day would demand work. She looked up when the bell rang, and the moment she recognized him, her expression changed, softening in the way faces did when they stopped bracing for trouble. "Thursday," she said, like they were naming a ritual. Raf managed a smile. "Still Thursday last I checked." "Give it 10 minutes," Ivy replied. "London might change its mind." Raf stepped toward the counter, careful not to clip the leaning towers of books with his shoulder. "How's the place?" he asked. Ivy's eyes flicked toward the back corridor, just a glance, quick as a blink. Then she smiled again, a practiced customer service smile that didn't quite cover whatever was under it. "Open," she said, still standing. Raf didn't miss the phrasing. Still standing was something you said about a person who'd been through something. He leaned his forearms on the counter, the way you did when you had no intention of buying anything but wanted to be anchored. "Anyone tried to set it on fire this week?" Ivy snorted. "Only emotionally." From somewhere atop the travel guides, a cat lifted its head. Marmalade, despite being mostly grey, blinked at Raf as if deciding whether he was a threat to stability. Raf nodded at him in greeting. Marmalade yawned, unimpressed by human politeness, and settled again. Ivy reached for the kettle behind the counter. "Tea?" she asked. Raf hesitated, out of habit, out of reluctance to accept things without paying. "If you've got time," he said. "I always have time for tea," Ivy replied, which was either a lie or a worldview. She poured, the stream of water steady, her hands sure. While she worked, Raf let his gaze drift along the shelves behind her. New arrivals, battered classics, slim poetry volumes, a stack of crime paperbacks with covers that promised blood and redemption in equal measure. His eyes snagged on a single paperback he didn't recognize and then somehow did. Cheap, glossy cover. A man in a coat walking away from the camera, a smear of red, the title, Beneath the Bridge. Raf frowned. A faint itch of familiarity scratched the back of his mind. "Seen a ghost?" Ivy asked, noticing his stare. "Maybe," Raf said. "Do you—" He stopped. He didn't even know what he was about to ask. Ivy followed his gaze, then her expression shuttered a fraction. "Just crime," she said too quickly, and slid the book a few centimeters out of sight behind a stack of receipts. Raf pretended not to notice. The shop was full of small, unspoken rules. Ivy placed a mug in front of him. The tea smelled good, strong, no nonsense. She didn't ask for money. She never did, not for tea. Raf didn't let that go unanswered. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded scrap of paper, and set it on the counter like a coin. Ivy's eyebrows lifted. "Paying with words again?" Raf tapped the folded scrap lightly. "It's the currency I've got," he said. Ivy unfolded it. She did this carefully now, as if she'd learned not to tear what she didn't understand. On the paper, in Raf's blunt handwriting, was a quotation. "A story is a stretcher. It carries what a body can't hold on its own." Ivy read it, then looked up. Something in her eyes shifted, recognition or discomfort, or the simple fact of being seen by a sentence. "That's actually good," she said. Raf shrugged. "Not mine." "That's the point," Ivy said. "Whose is it?" Raf stared at his tea. The steam rose between them like a thin curtain. "I don't know," he admitted. "That's the problem." Ivy's gaze sharpened. "You've been doing this for weeks," she said, "leaving quotes like tips." "I don't mean it like that," Raf said quickly. "I know," Ivy said, gentler. "I just don't understand it." Raf turned the mug slowly in his hands. The ceramic was warm. It helped. "I'm trying to remember a sentence," he said. "One sentence. And every time I get close, another one shows up instead. Like the wrong book on the right shelf." Ivy watched him for a long beat. "A sentence you lost," she said. Raf nodded. "Where did you lose it?" Ivy asked. He could have lied. He could have turned it into a joke, but he'd come here because this place didn't punish honesty with pity. "In a tunnel," he said, "underground." Ivy's fingers paused on the edge of the paper. "The tube?" she asked. Raf gave a small, humorless laugh. "Yeah, that. The glamorous heart of the city." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The shop held silence with more skill than most people. Somewhere behind them, a book fell, just a paperback sliding off a precarious stack, and thudded against the floor. Ivy didn't flinch, but her shoulders changed position as if her body catalogued any disturbance. Raf noticed and filed it away. Ivy, alert. Ivy, watching angles. Ivy, the kind of person who'd had her sense of normal rearranged recently. The bell rang again. A customer entered, shook out a coat, browsed the tables. Ivy straightened, customer face slipping back into place like a mask she could put on without thinking. Raf sipped his tea and waited. 1. By the third Thursday, the staff had developed opinions. Not Gideon. Gideon Bramble had opinions the way weather had opinions, constant and largely indifferent to your plans. But Ivy had been joined at the counter one afternoon by a part-time bookseller named Frances, a brisk woman in her 50s with a silver streak in her hair and a laugh like a page tearing. Frances watched Raf talk to Ivy, watched Raf leave behind a slip of paper with a quote, watched Ivy tuck it under the till with a care that looked almost tender. When Raf left, Frances leaned across the counter and said, "He's sweet." Ivy didn't look up from the receipt she was processing. He's tired, she said. Frances hummed. He likes you. Ivy's hand paused. He likes tea, she said, a little too flat. Frances smiled. That too. Ivy glanced toward the door Raph had just used, then back at Frances. He comes in like he's looking for something, she said quietly. Not someone. Frances's smile softened. Maybe it's both, she said, and returned to shelving. Ivy watched her go, then reached under the counter and pulled out the small stack of quote slips Raph had left over the last few weeks. She hadn't meant to keep them. The first one had been novelty. The second had been odd. By the fifth, she'd started collecting them like evidence. There were 8 now, folded and unfolded so often the creases were turning into tears. Some were famous lines, though not always accurately. Some were close enough to be recognizable but wrong in a way that felt deliberate rather than sloppy. And some were nowhere. Ivy had tried in her off hours to find them. She'd pulled down dictionaries of quotations, thumbed through anthologies, searched the spines in the shop as if the source might reveal itself if she looked long enough. She'd even, in a moment of desperation, typed one line into her phone in the tiny staff loo where Gideon couldn't see. The internet offered her nothing but blankness and a few indifferent, "Did you mean?" suggestions. One slip read, "You can't save everyone, but you can save the part of them that wanted saving." Another, "Books don't end, they just lose their readers." That one had made Ivy's skin prickle, because it sounded like it belonged in Gideon's mouth and in none of the books she'd ever read. She looked up at Gideon now. He stood at the far end of the shop with a ledger open, reading as if the paper might confess something if he stared long enough. His posture carried its own kind of fatigue, the sort that came from guarding something rather than running from it. Ivy slid the slips back under the till. When the bell rang and Raph came in, Ivy lifted her chin and tried to keep her voice light. "Back again," she said. Raph's smile was small. His eyes were rimmed with the faint red of someone who'd slept in fragments. He tugged his coat collar down and stood by the counter as if the air in the shop was something he could inhale. "Still here," he said. Ivy pushed a mug toward him without asking. "Tea's on," she said, and then, because she couldn't help herself, "Did you sleep at all?" Raph's mouth twisted. "Does 10 minutes in the passenger seat count?" "It counts as an insult," Ivy said. Raph laughed softly. "Then yes. I insulted myself repeatedly." Ivy watched him drink. His hands were steady, which meant the shift had been hard in a way that didn't leave tremors, more numbness than adrenaline. "Any new payments?" she asked, trying to sound like she was teasing. Raph hesitated, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a scrap of paper and placed it on the counter. Ivy unfolded it. The quote was written in cleaner handwriting than usual, as if he'd copied it carefully. "The past isn't behind you. It's shelved beside you, and you keep brushing it with your elbow." Ivy stared at it. Something about the line made her think of the back corridor, the locked door, the way Gideon's eyes sometimes flicked toward it, as if expecting it to open on its own. "You feel that?" Raph asked quietly. Ivy looked up. Raph's gaze was steady on her face, not flirtatious, more like concerned, like he'd said something and wanted to know if it had landed. "I do," Ivy admitted, and surprised herself with the honesty. Raph nodded, as if that mattered. "Me too," he said. Ivy folded the slip. "Where are you getting these?" she asked. Raph looked down at his mug. "I wish I knew," he said. "They turn up in my head like someone's leaving them in my pockets." Ivy's lips parted, then closed again. She didn't know how to respond without sounding like she was accusing him of madness. Raph glanced around the shop, taking in the towers of books, the narrow aisles. "You ever misplace something and then spend hours convinced it's watching you?" he asked. Ivy's heart gave a small, sharp jump. She thought of a paperback with marginal notes. She thought of a receipt dated tomorrow. She kept her face calm with effort. "Every day," she said. Raph's gaze held hers a moment longer than usual. Then he looked away, as if he'd seen something in her eyes he hadn't expected. "I'm not flirting," he said abruptly. Ivy blinked. "I didn't—" "I know," Raf said, embarrassed now, and rubbed the back of his neck. "People keep making jokes. At work. Here." His eyes flicked toward Francis, who was pretending not to listen from behind a shelf. "It's not that." Ivy's expression softened. "Okay," she said. "Then what is it?" Raf's mouth opened, closed again. He searched for words the way people searched for a vein in dim light, careful, reluctant. "I'm trying to remember a sentence I lost," he said again, but with more weight this time. "And I think it's here, in this shop. I think I read it here once." He swallowed. Once, and the word felt deliberate, not habitual. "I think it's the reason I keep coming." Ivy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafts. "Read it here," she repeated. "When?" Raf frowned. "That's the thing," he said. "I don't know, it feels like last month and 10 years ago at the same time." Ivy stared at him, trying not to show the sudden flare of alarm inside her. "Raf," she said quietly. "What's your full name?" He blinked. "Rafiq Mirza." "I'm Ivy," she said. "I work here. I'm not a doctor, but I'm good at noticing patterns." She tapped the folded slip. "These aren't random, and some of them—" She hesitated. "Some of them feel like they're looking right at me." Raf nodded, relief and worry mixing on his face. "Exactly," he said. "That's exactly it." From the back of the shop, Gideon's voice cut through. "Ivy." Ivy flinched slightly. Gideon rarely used her name unless he wanted something immediately. She looked up. Gideon stood near the corridor, ledger closed, eyes fixed on Raf with a hardness that hadn't been there before. "Who's that?" Gideon asked, though they both knew. Ivy answered anyway. "Raf," she said. "He comes in Thursdays." Gideon's gaze remained on Raf. "I know," he said. "I've noticed." Raf raised his mug slightly in greeting. "Morning," he said. Gideon did not return the greeting. He walked toward the counter with measured steps, as if approaching a spill. "What are you doing?" Gideon asked Raf. Raf blinked. "Having tea," he said. "Same as always." Gideon's eyes flicked to the folded quote slip under the till. "And leaving that," he said. Raf's cheeks colored. "It's just a—" "A what?" Gideon cut in. "A performance? A game?" Ivy felt her stomach lurch. Gideon's tone wasn't annoyance. It was suspicion edged with something like fear. "It's harmless," Ivy said quickly. Gideon looked at her. "Is it?" he asked softly, and there was a whole argument packed into the two words. Ivy held his gaze. "Yes?" she said, though she wasn't sure. Gideon's eyes returned to Raf. "You want to buy a book? Buy a book," he said. "If you want to loiter, go to a cafe. We're not a stage." Raf set his mug down carefully. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean—" Gideon's jaw moved as if grinding words. "Ivy," he said, not taking his eyes off Raf. "Back room, now." Ivy stared. "Why?" "Because I said so," Gideon replied, and his voice had the steel of a doorbolt sliding into place. Ivy looked at Raf. Raf looked back, startled, a little hurt, but not angry. "I'll go," Ivy said, though the words tasted wrong. She slipped out from behind the counter and walked toward the corridor. As she passed Gideon, she caught a faint smell on him, old paper and something metallic, like coins warmed in a palm. Her mind snagged on it. The smell had begun to mean trouble. 2. The back room wasn't really a room. It was a narrow space behind a curtain, lined with boxes and a small desk where Gideon kept paperwork that belonged to a different century. There was a kettle, a chipped mug rack, a stool that always wobbled. Ivy stood there and listened through the thin partition. Gideon's voice was low now, controlled. "Don't do it again," he said. Raf's voice drifted back, tired and bewildered. "Do what?" "The quotes," Gideon said. "Whatever you think you're doing, stop, and don't come in the back again." A beat. "I've never been in the back," Raf said. Ivy frowned. She was sure Raf had used the staff loo once, weeks ago when he'd looked on the edge of collapse, and Ivy had let him through without asking Gideon. Then Raff said quietly, "Actually, I have. Once. You weren't here." Ivy's skin prickled. Gideon's voice sharpened. "No." Raff sounded confused. "I didn't steal anything. I sat. I remember a chair by the radiator, a book on the desk, green cloth, no title, like it was hiding." Silence. The kind of silence that had a pulse. Ivy leaned closer to the curtain without thinking. Raff continued, cautious now. "I read a page," he said. "It wasn't even good. It was weird, like instructions pretending to be prose, but there was a line in it, one line." His voice caught on frustration. "And I can't get it back. That's why I'm here." Gideon spoke again, and the edge in his voice was unmistakable. "What's the title?" he asked. Raff hesitated. "That's the other thing," he said. "I don't know if it was the title or if it was a header, but it stuck. The Index of Quiet Doors." Ivy's breath stopped for a fraction of a second. She didn't know why those words hit like that. She'd never heard them before. But they arrived in her mind with the wrong kind of familiarity, like seeing a stranger and knowing their name. Out front, Gideon made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a laugh. Then, in a voice gone thin, he said, "Get out!" Raff blinked, audible even through the curtain. "What?" "Out of my shop!" Gideon said, louder now. "Now!" Ivy stepped forward, hand reaching for the curtain. Raff's voice rose, confused and hurt. "Gideon, I'm not threatening you, Don't say that name," Gideon snapped. "What name?" Raff asked, genuine confusion. Gideon sounded like he was forcing the next words through clenched teeth. "You don't come back here. You don't stand at my counter. You don't go near that corridor again, you understand?" A pause. Raff's voice turned careful, the way it did when he spoke to someone on the brink. "I don't understand, but I hear you," he said. "I'm sorry." The bell rang a moment later, and Ivy heard Raff's footsteps retreat. The door opened, closed. The bell chimed again, indifferent. Ivy stood frozen behind the curtain, staring at the boxes as if they held answers. The Index of Quiet Doors. She didn't know what it meant, but Gideon did. And Raff, who claimed not to be literary, who left quotes like breadcrumbs, had said it like it belonged to him. Ivy pushed through the curtain and stepped into the front. Gideon stood behind the counter, face pale, one hand braced on the wood. For a moment he looked older than his years, the way people looked when a memory surfaced too fast. Ivy approached slowly. "Gideon," she said. He didn't look up. "Don't," he said, a rough whisper. Ivy tried again. "He's not dangerous," she said. Gideon finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were bright with something Ivy did not want to name. Fear, grief, rage, all braided. "You don't know what dangerous looks like," he said. Ivy's pulse picked up. "Then tell me," she said. "Because he's a paramedic, Gideon. He's exhausted and kind, and he's looking for a sentence like it's a lifeline. That's not—" Gideon cut her off, voice low and sharp. "People can be kind and still carry poison," he said. Ivy stared at him. "Is that what you think he's carrying?" she asked. Gideon's jaw worked, as if he were biting back something he didn't trust himself to say. Then he turned away and began rearranging a stack of receipts with too much precision. The conversation for now was over, but Ivy's mind refused to let it go. She couldn't stop hearing Raff's voice through the curtain. Green cloth, no title, like it was hiding. And she couldn't stop seeing the way Gideon's face had drained when Raff said the name. Ivy went back behind the counter and opened the drawer where she kept Raff's quote slips. Her fingers hovered over the paper. Then she unfolded the newest one again, the stretcher line he'd left that morning. "A story is a stretcher. It carries what a body can't hold on its own." Ivy stared at the sentence until the words became shapes, then meaning again. It sounded like someone who knew what it was to carry bodies, and it sounded like someone who knew what it was to be carried by language. 3. That night, Raff didn't go straight home. He walked along the embankment, letting the river's dark surface pull his gaze away from everything he'd seen. The Thames looked like it always did, indifferent, heavy, pretending it had nothing to do with the city's secrets. Wind off the water cut through his coat and made his eyes water, which was useful because it gave him an excuse for the sting behind them. He replayed the conversation with Gideon Bramble, trying to understand what he'd stepped on. It wasn't the first time someone had thrown him out of a place. A&E waiting rooms did it all the time, politely after a job. There were always doors that closed behind you once your usefulness ended. But Gideon's reaction hadn't been about boundaries. It had been about recognition. Raff leaned on the railing and watched a barge slide past with slow insistence, like a thought that wouldn't leave. He remembered the back room, the chair by the radiator, the green book on the desk. He remembered opening it. He remembered the feeling of the paper, thick, faintly rough at the edge, old but not fragile. He remembered the typeface, Victorian and stern, the sort used for sermons and serious notices. He remembered thinking absurdly that the book looked like it had been made to survive, and he remembered the sentence. Or he remembered the shape of it, the space it occupied in his head, the way it had lit something in him and then, when he blinked, slid away like a fish in dark water. He pressed his fingers to his temple as if he could squeeze the memory back into place. He could not. What he could remember, painfully clearly, was the moment he'd lost it. It had been a night call weeks ago, an alarm at Leicester Square Station. "Mail collapsed, possible cardiac," the dispatcher had said, and Raff had felt the usual rush of readiness, the body taking over, leaving thought behind. He and his crewmate, Joe, had arrived to find station staff gathered at a cordoned-off service corridor. A man sat on the ground with his back to the tiles, grey as ash. Another man, older in a worn coat, stood nearby arguing with a transport officer, voice urgent in a way that made Raff's skin prickle. "Back," Raff had said, brisk, and people had parted. He'd knelt beside the patient, assessed, pulse thready, breathing shallow, sweat cold. Raff had called for oxygen for a stretcher. Routine. Then he'd looked up briefly and seen something that hadn't belonged. A scrap of paper on the floor near the service corridor, torn from a book. Thick, creamy, too fancy to be litter, and stamped faintly with an emblem, a fox holding a key. Raff hadn't known why his attention snagged on it. In emergencies, you learn to notice irrelevant details because sometimes they weren't irrelevant. He'd picked it up without thinking and tucked it into his pocket, meaning to hand it to station staff later. Later never came. The patient had arrested. Raff had done compressions. Joe had pushed adrenaline. The station air had filled with the smell of metal and sweat and panic. Then the patient had regained a rhythm, and they'd rushed him out, and the night had folded into the next call, and the next, and the next. When Raff got home at dawn, he'd emptied his pockets and found the torn page. He'd unfolded it. There was a message on it, half-written, the ink broken off as if the writer had been interrupted. "If you can read this, it means then nothing, torn away." Raff had stared at it, annoyed by the incompleteness. And in the corner, printed in a tidy block like a library stamp, there had been a line of metadata. Returned by Friday 10:14. Below it, shelf, crime B4, and a tiny printer's mark that meant nothing to him, BCCHX/001. He'd thought it was the library paperwork, some private collector's joke. But when he'd looked at the half-message again, the words had changed in his head. Not on the paper, he hadn't been that kind of mad, but in his mind as if the fragment had pulled other fragments toward it. A sentence had assembled itself, clean and sharp, like a blade sliding from a sheath. It had been the sentence he'd been chasing ever since, and then, when the kettle whistled and he glanced away for a second, the sentence had vanished, leaving him with nothing but the ache of absence. Raff had kept the page anyway, not out of sentiment, out of stubbornness. Then, 2 days later, the torn page had disappeared from his kitchen table. He'd searched the flat, turned over cushions, checked bins. Nothing. It was gone, as if it had never existed. He hadn't told anyone. He hadn't wanted to sound like a man who misplaced paper and invented conspiracy to protect his dignity. But his mind had kept reaching for the sentence, like a tongue reaching for a missing tooth. That was when he'd started going to Bramble and Company. not because he believed the shop had stolen his page. Because he'd felt, unreasonably, irrationally, that the shop was where the sentence belonged, and if he stood in the right place long enough, perhaps it would come back. Now Gideon had thrown him out like a contagion. Raff stared at the Black River and wondered whether he'd been right to keep coming. He wondered whether he should have taken the hint and left the city to its own strange punctuation. Then, unbidden, a line arrived in his mind. Another quote, clean as if printed. Some places don't want your feet, they want your attention. Raff exhaled slowly. He didn't know where it came from. He didn't know whether it was warning or invitation. But he knew, with the steady certainty he usually reserved for vital signs, that the bookshop wasn't done with him. 4. On the next Thursday, Raff broke his own rule and came in anyway. He told himself he was only going to apologize. He told himself he would keep it simple. Say, sorry, leave, stop making trouble in other people's lives. He arrived later than usual after sleeping for 3 hours and waking with his mind still full of fluorescent hospital corridors. The morning crowd had thickened, Bramble and company, held customers like a pocket held coins, tight, constant. The bell rang when he entered. Ivy looked up first. Her face changed. Surprise, then worry, then something like resolve. Behind her, Gideon looked up more slowly, as if he'd sensed Raff before the bell confirmed it. The moment their eyes met, Gideon's expression hardened. Raff lifted his hands slightly, palms out. "I'm not here to argue," he said. Gideon's voice carried across the shop, low but sharp enough to cut. "You were told." "I know," Raff said. His throat felt dry. "I'm sorry." A customer at the poetry shelf glanced over, then returned to browsing with exaggerated indifference. Ivy stepped forward. "Gideon," she began. Gideon's gaze didn't leave Raff. "Out!" he said. "Now!" Raff nodded. He had expected it. He turned toward the door. Then Ivy spoke quickly before Raff could leave. "Wait," she said. Raff paused, looking back. Ivy's eyes flicked to Gideon, then to the corridor, then back to Raff. Her face had the look of someone walking a thin line between curiosity and caution. "You said you were trying to remember a sentence," Ivy said. "Can you tell me what you do remember?" Gideon snapped. "Ivy!" Ivy didn't look at him. "Please," she said to Raff, and there was a quiet insistence in the word. Raff hesitated. He shouldn't. He knew he shouldn't. Gideon had made it plain. Boundary, door, leave. But Ivy's question landed differently, not like a hook, like an outstretched hand. Raff took a breath that tasted of paper dust. "I remember a green book," he said. "I remember reading it here, in the back, and I remember a line that—" He stopped, frustrated. It felt like something I needed, like instructions you didn't know you were missing. Gideon's face went gray around the mouth. Raff continued carefully. "I didn't take it. I didn't even know it was special. I'm not—" He gestured vaguely at the shelves. "This isn't my world. I'm just—" He searched for the honest word. "Tired." Ivy nodded once, as if that explained more than Raff meant. "And the quotes?" Ivy asked. Raff almost laughed. "They're what show up instead," he said. "I can't find the sentence I lost, so my head throws me other sentences like it's trying to pay me off." Ivy's mouth twitched. "Like hush money," she murmured. Raff nodded. "Exactly." Gideon's voice came out rough. "Stop talking," he said. "Both of you." Ivy finally turned to him. "Why?" she asked. Gideon's eyes flashed. "Because he's not safe," he said. Raff flinched. "I'm not—" Gideon cut him off. "It's not about your job," he said. "It's not about your kindness. It's about what you've touched." Raff stared at him. "Touched?" he repeated. Gideon's gaze flicked to Raff's coat pocket, as if he could see through fabric and time. "You bring pieces with you," he said, voice low. "You don't even know you're doing it." Raff's skin prickled. "I don't know what you mean." Ivy's eyes widened slightly. She glanced at Raff again, as if seeing him differently. Raff felt suddenly exposed in a way he couldn't name. Gideon leaned forward across the counter, voice almost a whisper. "You need to leave," he said, "for your own good." Raff stared at him. In Gideon's eyes, there was something like sincerity under the hostility, a kind of frightened protectiveness that didn't know how to speak gently anymore. Raff nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I will." He shifted his weight toward the door, then stopped. "But I need to ask one thing." Gideon's jaw moved. "No." Raff held his ground. "Do you know the sentence?" he asked. "The one I'm missing." Gideon's expression changed so fast, Raff almost didn't catch it. Not denial, recognition. Then Gideon's mouth set into a line of refusal. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Raff let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sigh. "You do," he said quietly. "You do know. I can see it." Gideon's eyes sharpened. "Get out," he said again. Raff nodded. "All right," he said. "I'm going." He stepped toward the door. Ivy's voice came after him, softer. "Raff." He turned. Ivy didn't speak loudly. She didn't want Gideon to hear, though he was standing 3 feet away and certainly did. "Bring me one of the quotes you can't source," she said. "Next time, if there is a next time." Raff blinked. "Why?" he asked. Ivy's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes did, resolve settling into place. "Because I'm good at finding things," she said. Raff almost smiled. "That sounds like flirting," he said, because humor was easier than gratitude. Ivy rolled her eyes. "Get out," she said, echoing Gideon, but with a different flavor. Raff nodded and pushed open the door. The bell rang as he left. He didn't see the folded page slip from his pocket. 5. Ivy found it 10 minutes later when she went to sweep the entryway and clear damp leaf litter customers tracked in. The paper lay near the threshold, folded tight into a rectangle. At first glance, it looked like a receipt someone had dropped. Ivy bent, picked it up, and immediately felt the difference. Receipts were thin. This paper had body, rag paper, thick, with a tooth that caught at her fingertips. She unfolded it carefully. It was torn from a larger page, edges jagged. There were remnants of printed text along one side, Victorian serif letters, faded and slightly uneven like old ink. Near the top, as if someone had stamped it on the way out, was an emblem pressed into the paper, a fox holding a key. Ivy's stomach dipped. She had seen that mark before, faint inside a paperback cover, the day she'd found a return slip dated tomorrow. She had told herself it was just a collector's stamp, a quirky book plate, a coincidence. Seeing it again made coincidence feel lazy. In the corner of the torn page, printed in a tidy block, were small lines of metadata. Ivy's eyes skimmed them without absorbing, distracted by what mattered more. The inked message running across the center, half-finished, as if the writer had stopped mid-thought. The message wasn't addressed to Ivy. It began, "Marion, if you can read this, it means the binding held for at least one." Then the rest was gone, torn away. Ivy stared. Marion. Not a name she recognized from customers, not a staff name, not a name she'd heard Gideon say. She read it again, slower, feeling the odd intimacy of being handed a message meant for someone else. Then she noticed the handwriting, ink, not pencil. Careful, slanted slightly, as if written by someone who wanted the words to look controlled even if the situation wasn't. It didn't feel like Raff's handwriting. Raff's quote slips were blunt, hurried, sometimes smudged. This was deliberate. Ivy's mind started building a map of its own. Raff dropping the page. Raff talking about a green book. Gideon reacting to a title. The fox and key stamp. The half-message to someone named Marion. And somewhere in all of it, like a small stone in a shoe, the memory of that impossible return slip. Ivy folded the page and slid it into her cardigan pocket. Not because she wanted to hide it from Gideon, because she didn't trust Gideon not to hide it from her. She returned to the counter, heart moving too fast for no physical reason. Gideon watched her approach. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he could sense paper in her pocket, like a scent. "What was that?" he asked, voice low. "A customer dropped something," Ivy said evenly. Gideon's gaze stayed on her pocket. "A receipt?" Ivy forced a shrug. Probably, she said. Gideon didn't look convinced, but he didn't press, perhaps because pressing meant admitting fear, and Gideon treated fear like a weakness he couldn't afford. Ivy turned toward the shelves, pretending to arrange spines. Her fingers brushed the torn page in her pocket, feeling its thickness. She told herself she would look at it properly later, when she could breathe without Gideon's eyes on her. She did not notice, not yet, that the metadata printed in the corner read, "Return by Friday 10/14, shelf, crime B4, BCCHX/001. She did not connect it to the time stamped on the impossible slip from weeks ago. Not yet. And because she didn't notice, the story stayed open. 6. Raph walked away from the shop, feeling as if he'd left a piece of himself inside. Not metaphorically. Physically. His coat pocket felt lighter. He patted it without thinking, checking for his keys, his ID, the tiny notebook he kept out of habit. Everything important was there. Still, something was missing. He didn't realize what until he reached the corner and stopped under the awning of a closed flower stall. The city moved around him in grey currents. People flowed toward work. Phones glowed in hands. Everyone carried a private narrative. Raph leaned against the brick and closed his eyes. A sentence hovered just beyond reach, close enough to feel, like a word on the tip of a tongue. He pictured the torn page again, the one he'd once found at the station, the one that had vanished from his table. He pictured the fox and key emblem pressed into paper. He pictured that block of printed metadata as if it were trying to become a coordinate. He didn't know why Friday 10/14 mattered. He only knew that the numbers felt like a door code. His phone buzzed, a message from Joe. "You alive, pub?" Raph stared at it. Joe meant well. Joe always meant well. But pubs meant noise, laughter, the easy ritual of decompressing by pretending the night's work was just a series of stories you could tell with punchlines. Raph typed back, "Sleep later." He pocketed the phone. Then, without meaning to, he spoke aloud, quiet, under the awning, to no one. "I'm trying to remember." His voice sounded strange in the open air, too personal for the street. A line arrived in his head again, crisp and unwanted. "The mind keeps what the body can't bury." Raph closed his eyes harder, as if pressure would rearrange thoughts into the missing sentence. It didn't. He opened his eyes and started walking again, back toward the tube, because he couldn't go home until he knew whether he was moving away from the problem or toward it. At the station entrance, the familiar announcement played, tinny and cheerful, "Mind the gap." Raph paused, listening. He almost laughed. It wasn't the sentence. It couldn't be. And yet, something in his chest reacted to the words, as if they'd been aimed at him personally. He went down the stairs into the underground's warm breath, and the city swallowed. No, not swallowed. The city took him in, the way it took everyone, whether they noticed or not. 7. That evening, after Gideon had closed the shop early under the excuse of inventory, an excuse he used whenever the world felt too close, Ivy sat on the backroom stool with the torn page spread on her knees. Marmalade prowled the shelves above her, bored by human secrets. The backroom's lamp cast a small circle of light. Outside it, boxes rose like silent witnesses. Ivy read the half-message again. "Marion, if you can read this, it means the binding held for at least one." "One what?" "One day, one loop, one return." Her mind kept snagging on the word binding. It sounded like craft, not magic. A practical word, made for hands and glue and thread. It also sounded like a promise you didn't want to make. She finally let her gaze drift to the corner of the page where the printed block sat. "Return by Friday 10/14, shelf, crime B4, BCCHX/001. Ivy frowned, not because she recognized it, but because it looked so official, so mundane. Bookshop admin disguised as prophecy. She traced the fox and key emblem with her fingertip, feeling the faint indentation in the paper. The same mark as the faint bookplate stamp she'd found inside that crime paperback weeks ago. A thought crossed her mind, irritating and persistent. What if none of this was mystical at all? What if it was logistics, cataloging, returns, shelf codes, being used as a skeleton for something else? Books moved through shops like blood through a body. They left, returned, got stamped, got reshelved. A schedule of circulation. A return by date was a kind of tether. A shelf code was a location in a maze. A printer's mark was proof of origin. Ivy stared at the numbers again. Friday, 10:14. Her breath caught slightly. She looked up instinctively at the clock in the front room. Even through the wall, she could almost picture it. 10:14. The time had been on that impossible return slip, the one she'd tried to forget because remembering it made the world feel less stable. Ivy sat very still, the torn page warming under her fingers. She could go to Gideon. She could demand an explanation. She could wave the page and watch his face change again, watch him retreat behind orders and silence. Or she could do what she'd always done before Bramble and Company hired her. She could investigate quietly. Ivy folded the page carefully and slid it into her notebook between drafts of her own novel. Her novel's title stared up at her from the cover, handwritten in ink. The Girl Who Finds Things. Ivy stared at it, then let out a small laugh that was not amused. "Fine," she whispered to the empty room. She stood, turned off the lamp and went out into the shop, where the shelves waited in dark rows like closed mouths. Tomorrow was Friday, and at 10:14 someone, Raph, Gideon, Marion, or someone else entirely, had left a marker as if time itself could be shelved. Ivy locked the door, checked the bolt twice, and went home with the torn page in her bag and the faint sense that London was keeping a ledger of her movements. Somewhere in a sentence she couldn't yet retrieve, the next instruction waited.